Well, thank you for coming. Thank you for such a lovely introduction. Thank you, Colin, for making this happen. I'm really grateful. So, yes, I've got some really lovely memories of being here. Naz and I were talking about doing our first lecture together was that in 2004? So I'd come from a local primary school, and I'd sort of moved from that space of being thought of by some as a sort of teacher expert, professional expert of some kind. And then I came here, and then suddenly I moved into that different world that many of us have moved into, where you sort of feel like a bit of a fraud. And, you know, and you're expected to know things that maybe that you don't know, and all that sort of stuff. So I was here for 2 years. I was seconded here. And it was really being here and sort of engaging with people and thinking about ideas made me want to think about completing a doctorate. And I went over to New Zealand and did that, and I'm now working at the University of Otago. So it's been a really interesting journey. Just picking up on something you just said, one of the things that really hit me, though, when I got there was how it felt like I was in this strange parallel universe where lots of things were very familiar, and then some things were a bit different. And some of the things the colleagues were saying were very like some of the things that were being said here. A couple of years after that, I was watching the news, and I was listening to Hekia Parata, who's the education minister, talking. And I really wish I'd written the details down, but I'd just read something that Michael Gove had said, and it was the same thing. And it really it really intrigued me that these two people who were actually very different to each other were saying exactly the same thing as each other. And it sort of made me really wonder where that was coming from. And so there's things going on for all of us. There's these big international sort of waves of ideas, and there's policy from people like OECD that are impacting on all our lives, and so our experiences are very similar, I think. It might be that what I'm going to say actually is old news as well, because from a very, very brief conversation, I think some of the things that are happening to us now in our universities in New Zealand have already happened here. So I'm very interested to hear your perspective, so please do stop me, and let's talk. Okay. So if I just click onto the next slide, this was the sort of the brief. I'll just give you a moment to look at that. Okay, just recently somebody said to me, in fact, it's been said a number of times. Somebody says to me, is university really the best place for teacher education, for initial teacher education? Are you really the people that should be doing this? And I suppose having a good answer to that question is really important, and I'm not sure I had one. Though I've sort of given it some thought since, and I think I've got a better one. I think that, at best, universities in partnership with school can do something really, really wonderful. I think the question that we've got to ask is that happening? Is the sort of the vision and purpose of having universities in partnership with schools to provide initial teacher education, are we delivering on sort of the potential for that? Okay, so background on New Zealand. The market approach was introduced in the 90s, and they ended up with proliferation of programs of varying quality, and in the end the government had to sort of step in, and there was a moratorium on new programs, and things have tightened up. So there's diverse pathways, but at the moment there's no fully school-based pathways in New Zealand. There's most teacher education, initial teacher education, is happening in universities. It's very high. It's sort of for primary and secondary, it's almost 100%. For early childhood, I think it's around 50% at the moment. But we've also, around in sort of up to 2006, and this is where I think we're going to see some similarities. New Zealand had colleges of teacher education, and so sort of known as TCOLs, and they were absorbed into universities. So it would be a little bit like if Hope had become part of Liverpool University, and the Department of Education at Liverpool University had sort of come together with Hope, and it just been brought into the bigger part of the university. So that's where it's at now. So the last of those was in 2006, and it was at Otago where I work. For the people from the old college, it was a really painful, difficult time where the rules all changed, everything flipped. So people who'd been employed because they were professional experts and were recognised for their professional expertise suddenly moved into a new world where it didn't really count for much. And so sort of research was what was really important. There was another policy like, is it still RAE here, the Research Assessment Exercise, or RAF? Okay, so at the same time, New Zealand got PBRF, Performance-Based Research Fund. And that's, as I understand it, I think it's actually worse than what you've got, because individuals are measured, so it's not just departments. Every individual has their own research portfolio, and we're all as individuals, we're either graded as being research inactive, or we get different bands, and that's what attracts the funding. So there's intense pressure on individuals to be producing that research. So for the former people from the colleges, who most of them are more mature than other people in the university, it's a different aged workforce. It was actually a very, very difficult time of insecurity. And then since 2006, where I work, we've actually had 4 rounds of redundancies. And the people who've lost their jobs are the people who don't look good on the research front. But some of them have been outstanding teachers. One of the problems with that is that they were the people who had the relationships with our colleagues in schools. They were the people who were valued. And so it's caused us difficulty in terms of our relationship with schools, because the schools imagine that the people at the university are pointy heads who haven't been teachers, which actually isn't true, but that's what people believe. Okay, so there's been cynicism and grief and pain of sort of both sides, I think, for everyone, and also for even the people who are experienced researchers, there's been intense pressure on them to actually to produce. So we started to look we look at Viv Ellis's work. Viv Ellis was at Oxford and is now at Brunel, and he'd done this fascinating work here in England and in Scotland, looking at the work of teacher educators, and sort of one of the things that he did find was that relationship maintenance was something that teacher educators do and takes up extensive amounts of time. So if you think of comparing the research output of somebody who's in a different discipline, they might be able to get on with research and focus on things in a way that people who are interacting daily with schools just don't have the luxury of doing. One of the people I've just been working with recently was telling me about this crisis they dealt with in school, and the hours they put into it were just enormous and couldn't be reflected in any workload. And so at the moment in New Zealand, and perhaps here, we're sort of judged alongside people who aren't in professional programs, and other departments look at us and say, well, why aren't you producing as much research when maybe the situation's slightly different? Joss Nuttall and Mary Brennan and company, they took this up from Viv, and they started to look at Australia. And it was interesting, because I would have expected the Australians to find exactly the same thing, but they actually found something quite different. And what they found was, in Australia, the actual notion of teacher education was invisible. And they'd looked at the job descriptions and advertisements for positions in schools of education, and it was like you had to really read to actually find any reference to working with schools, or the front end of all the adverts was all about promoting the institutions where the universities. This is the best research university in the state, and things like that. And so the notion of being a teacher educator was sort of diminished. Okay, so then our study. So we're looking at these things, and so we were interested, first of all, and most of what I'll talk about is this first research question. And we were looking at how the category of teacher education is currently being constructed and maintained by New Zealand universities. So, and the way that well, I'll talk about how we've done that in a minute, but we're interested in the institutional constructions and what the implications of those constructions are. So what the universities are doing, how they're constructing teacher educators, and how that actually fits with what we think the future might hold. Okay, so what we've done is we've taken advertisements, job descriptions, and then we've interviewed the people who are responsible for them. And so we've sort of taken all that data and had a real dig into it. Okay, and then our second question was, this time we've sort of zoomed right in on teacher educators, and we're asking about the practical activities and the material conditions of university-based teacher educators in New Zealand. So this work's going on. We've collected most of the data. I'll talk about it, but it's not as tight. And so what we're arguing, certainly from the data from the first ones, is that the binary thinking that we hear talk of is actually being reinforced by what's happening. So the theory-practice divide seems to be getting stronger. Research and teaching are separated. And academic and professional are different things. If we think back to sort of ideas of why we want teacher education in universities, I guess you'd want them to bridge those things. You'd want our teacher educators to be well versed in research and to be also well versed in practice. Marilyn Cochrane-Smith talked about teacher educators being linchpins and, sort of bringing that together. And yet, I guess that sort of divide, that's something we're all familiar with. Is that right? Is that sort of... Okay. And finally, this is difficult for us because we've got this big policy change that's ahead of us. There's been signals that teacher education is going to be at master's level. And in the New Zealand context, we need people to have current New Zealand teacher registration in order to be teacher educators, so to visit schools, to work with our students. So it's like having... we need to keep our registration up every 3 years, so we need to prove to the Teachers' Council that we're up to it as teachers. But at the same time, we need people with doctorates to deliver this course. So we need these people, and we'll be arguing here that actually what's happening in terms of employment practice isn't putting us in a good place to be able to do this. Okay, so for our data collection, we had an RA working with us, and she scanned 6 months' worth of jobs advertised at the UniJobs website, and also institutional websites, so she was looking for us. She found 37 positions that we then examined closely, and we found that 11 of those were actually teacher education jobs that we considered to be largely involved in initial teacher education. What was fascinating actually, and this is a bit of an aside, were the jobs that weren't advertised, because we actually know that positions at different universities, people have moved into positions with no sign of that in terms of advertising. There's been, and so, I mean, that'd be a different piece of research, but it does raise questions. Okay, and so we managed to get 7 interviews with the contact people, the people responsible for those positions. Okay, so again, you'll sort of, if you've read Viv Ellis's stuff, you'll see that we've replicated it, not exactly, but fairly closely. So we sort of used MCA. We've looked at word frequencies. My colleagues, sorry, I should have said at the start, there's 4 of us in this project. I should have told you about them as well. There's 2 colleagues from Auckland University and 2 from the University of Otago. My colleagues from Auckland did the discourse analysis, so when I talk about that, I'll mention it very briefly, but sort of, if you ask me a hard question, I might not be able to answer it. And so initially we all worked together to make sure we were on the same page, and then we went off into 2 groups and sort of got on with the work. Okay, we used MVivo, we sort of went through the advertisements, identified nouns, we looked at verbs, we looked at the attributes, the characteristics of the people they wanted. The cells are a really interesting thing, the way the universities sell themselves, the stories they tell about themselves. We looked for dominant discourses. Then we got hold of the job descriptions, did the same thing, and then with the transcription of the interviews again, we sort of looked at all that again. And it was a really very, very interesting process. Sorry, I've got the wrong slide here. Yeah, so once we'd done that, we got... we put a table together with all the verbs, the attributes, the keywords, the dominant themes. And it really started to become very, very clear. I was working with my colleague Alex Gunn, and it was really, given those moments when it's so hard to get time to research, it can feel like a real chore. And then there's moments when you get data in front of you and it gets really exciting. And we started to see some really clear things. And what we found was that there were 3 clear types of construction in terms of our teacher educators. We had these professional experts who were the people who, I'm sure you'll recognise, these are the people who've got sort of recent school-based experience. They're people who have got credibility in the school community, who we bring in. Then there's the traditional academic role, so there's people, there's sort of the you know, there'd be things that they'd be expected to have a really good track record in terms of publications. They would be able to attract funding. They'd be able to score well in our PBRF. They'd make the institution look good. And then there's this little category in the middle, which we're calling duly qualified. So a duly qualified person is sort of all of that. School experience and a doctorate. And you'll be familiar with the work as well, teaching, research and service. Typically, in these jobs, the professional experts get very little or no research time, whereas the academics and the duly qualified people in the New Zealand university system, we'd have 40% teaching, 40% research, 20% service. Though, it actually doesn't work like that, but that's where it looks like on paper. Service can be service. Service is a really odd thing actually, because it would involve things like interviewing students. It could involve serving on committees elsewhere in the university. I was drafted in to look at literacy requirements for health sciences for their admission, and so that would count as service. But it also it's sort of, some people do lots of service. It's not measurable. It's sort of a blob of time that it doesn't fit, and it can be extensive. Okay, so I don't know. That's probably really hard to read, but I'll just point out a couple of things. The professional expert, you'll see the verbs that we picked up. I mean, it's about teaching. It's about delivering courses. There's language there about working under supervision. There's language around status, and it's fairly low status. Those people would have a degree or a postgraduate level qualification. They've got the teacher registration, which is important. The duly qualified in the middle, teacher registration again, but we've got research coming into that. And then the traditional academic, there's no need for teacher registration. If you're a traditional academic, you're not part of that world. That's really important, because if you haven't got teacher registration, you're excluded from the work that's extensive and doesn't get you much reward. In terms of research output, a traditional academic would have a huge advantage over the other categories. Okay, so then we myself and Alex, my colleague, were very excited. We met up with our colleagues from Auckland, and they'd done the discourse analysis. So just give you a moment to read that. Okay, and I've sort of, this is the only slide I'll show you of their work, but I don't know if you can see, but you've got sort of, down this side, they sort of picked up on the assessment as a discourse. They've got supervision, there's research, the requirement for research. And if we look at research, you can see that across those positions, research is missing till you get to the middle. And again, sorry, shouldn't be wandering away from this. So you see, sort of on this side we've got research. On the other side, we've got teacher registration again. So our colleagues found exactly the same thing we did, but then in this middle space, there's actually only really one position that covers those. Okay, and then for the phase 2 data collection, and this is all getting very exciting, but this is where the work's actually in progress. So we invited colleagues from 2 universities to take part in our study, and I wasn't holding my breath in terms of a response, because we were actually asking a lot of people. We were asking them to be interviewed, to complete work diaries for a week on 2 separate occasions. We were asking them to be work shadowed for a day of their work, and I think that was actually the rub for a lot of people. There were a couple of people who said to me, I would have done it, but the thought of having somebody with me all day, I couldn't cope with. And so we've done that work, and it's just been fascinating and actually very humbling to spend. I spent a week in Auckland, and spending each day with people from the start of the day to the end of the day, you just see how amazing people are, the work they do, under very difficult conditions. Viv Ellis said in his work that it was teacher educators that made partnership work at their own expense. And that's what I saw with these people. I saw people putting in incredible hours, but not letting students down, though they didn't really have time to do things. They were absolutely there for the students. And then we, at the end of the year, we've got a workshop where we're working with the people who we've been researching. And we'll be doing some of the same sort of things. I've started to do that already. I've been working through the transcripts of the telephone interviews. Really interesting work, and I'll sort of move on to that in a second. Okay, so the emerging findings from that was this, and this is the important thing. In some way, all our participants were engaged in research. The thing that surprised me about that is that 4 of them were excluded from the work of research in terms of what their jobs allowed, and yet and 2 of them had previously had research as part of their work, but had it taken from them in a bit of a reshuffle. Because if people have jobs without research as part of a research component, they don't need to do PBRF. So as an institution, you want your researchers to be doing research, and if they're not great researchers, you want to sort of shove them off and get more teaching out of them. And so two of the people were actually doing research on Sunday mornings outside of their work time. They all understood this connection between teaching and research. Though I'm talking about research in a wider sense. And the other thing is that, I mentioned this sort of the 40-40-20 split of the way our work works. One of the things I've done some star graphs. I didn't show it because my colleagues haven't really seen them yet, but if you look at the work people are doing, it's nothing like 40-40-20. It's students, it's school, it's teaching, and then there's tiny bits of research when you can, fitted in when possible. So we're arguing that this sort of split between researchers on one side who don't have access to the full work of teacher education, who are not familiar with schools, and then on the other side, practice experts, we're saying that it's reinforcing. We're saying that the approach that the universities are taking is reinforcing this split, this divide between the two things, and so if employment practices continue, it will sort of spoil the vision of teachers, of university-based initial teacher education. It will disrupt that. And we're also saying that if the New Zealand government wants to adopt these our new master's level pathways into teacher education, if that becomes the way forward, and there's been talk in the past of our undergraduate pathways going, if they're going to do that, we won't have the capability to actually to deliver them. We won't be able to do it. And we're also concerned about the sort of, we've talked about the policy interface between PVRF and postgraduate initial teacher education. The two things, the two government policies are actually working against each other. Okay, so a couple of possibilities. What if? So what if this world that it looks like is happening is we've just got academics and we've got practice experts? What are the, what will happen there? Well, we're arguing that academic and practical work will be separated. The ideas of research-informed evidence bases for teaching, are challenged, and that neither of those constructions actually serve the full work of initial teacher education. And as I said, we won't be able to realise these aspirations for postgraduate initial teacher education. What if we have duly qualified? Well, that's, in a sense, it responds to this idea of, we've called it a great leap backwards, but, the separation of teacher education and sort of an educational research. But it expands practice to support evidence-based teaching. But then we're left with these, what Viv Ellis in his work called the super-academic expectations, perhaps unreasonable expectations that somebody's going to be a researcher, be in school, do all those things. And so there needs to be some sort of flex to respond to super-academic expectations. And I'm sure there'll be others which maybe we can talk about. What if we have a world, though, where there's only practice experts, perhaps where it's all school-based, and then with content brought in, which which you've already got, haven't you? Is that right? Is there a that's possibly a dearth of scholarship within teaching, pressure on schools to actually deliver that, and again, I'm sure that there's other considerations. Okay, so I've actually been much quicker than I meant to be, but closing thoughts. Really, we feel that our universities need to look long-term in terms of their work in teacher education. I don't think it's beyond imagining that we would lose initial teacher education from universities, that it would go. And I suspect there's actually people in universities who would welcome that, because teacher education across the world isn't great at producing research. We don't make our universities look good in terms of research standing. I think our universities need to flex to recognise the full scope of the work of teacher educators. Currently, we would be, a lot of the work that we do isn't recognised. So, for instance, for promotion, the work you do in schools doesn't count. There's a number of configurations, but clearly the most important thing is your publication record. And that seems to be more important than the quality of your teaching. Though the university would point out that the quality of teaching is really important. And finally, I think that we need to communicate a coherent vision of why teacher education is in universities and what we're doing, because it strikes me that even amongst ourselves, sometimes we have a bit of a blurred view of why it's here. And our philosophy is about, just recently, a colleague said to me, we were talking about a student that was having difficulty in school, and a colleague said, well, you've either got it or you haven't. I was like, well, what are we doing? And equally, we hear there's sort of discussions that we will, often see different views of teacher education which actually don't recognise teachers as professionals. Okay, I think I'll stop there, if that's okay. And,